Hey, brothers and sisters in Christ. I just wanted to encourage you today from Psalm 77. And this was a psalm written by Asaph, who was one of the worship leaders during King David's time. And we learn that from 1 Chronicles chapter 6, verses 31 to 39. And in this psalm, Asaph cries out to the Lord in his distress. We see in verse 1, he says, I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord at night. I stretched out untiring hands, and my soul refused to be comforted. So many of us can relate to Asaph in those times of distress and feeling like God is silent to our prayers. For Asaph, it got to the point where he was even unable to sleep. In verse 4, he says, You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. So he couldn't even sleep at night because of this distressing situation. And we don't know exactly what situation it was, but it's something that many of us can relate to. The stress of the situation or circumstance we're going through and it keeping us awake at night. And it was to the point where it felt like God was silent to Asaph's cries for help. In verse 7 to 9, he says, Will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? It got to the point where Asaph was questioning God as to whether he was truly merciful and loving or whether he had forgotten him in his circumstance and distress. Something that so many of us can relate to. And so how did Asaph overcome this situation? And how do we overcome those circumstances in life where it feels like God is silent to our prayers and our cries for help? Well, the first key is found in verse 11, where Asaph says, I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. The first thing Asaph did was reminded himself of the miracles that God had done in the past for Israel. Specifically, we see in the context of the rest of this psalm, from verses 14 to 19, that it talks about how God rescued and redeemed Israel from Egypt in the Exodus and led them through the Red Sea. In verse 19, your path led through the sea. And so the first thing we're called to do is remind ourselves of what God has done in the past, the miracles he's done in the past, not only for Israel, not only what Jesus has done for us in the New Testament by his death and resurrection on the cross, and remembering what Jesus did while he was on this earth in healing the sick, giving sight to the blind, and raising the dead, and doing all kinds of miracles, signs, and wonders. But also reminding ourselves of the miracles that the Lord has done for us personally in our own lives in the past. Because if he has done it before, he can do it again. And so the first key to being able to overcome in times of distress is not focusing on our own circumstance, but actually focusing on God and the miracles that he has done in the past. Asaph goes on in verse 12 to say, I will meditate on all your works and consider all your mighty deeds. So he chose to take his eyes off his circumstance and meditate and focus on the works and the mighty deeds the Lord had done in the past. So the question is, what has the Lord done for you in your past and in the Bible? Have you reminded yourself of what he has done so that you can encourage yourself that what he has done before, he can do again? The second thing that Asaph did was that he focused on the greatness and holiness of God. We find this in verse 13. He says, "Your ways, O God, are holy. What God is so great as our God?" The second key is to focus on how great, how magnificent, how wonderful, how powerful our God is, the God that we serve. And when you focus on how huge and magnificent and wonderful he is, all of a sudden your circumstance doesn't become as daunting or distressing compared to how huge our God is. The third thing Asaph did is found in verse 19. And that is to remember that God is at work even when we don't see the tangible evidence of his presence. You see, in verse 19, he talks about God parting the Red Sea. He says, "Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen." What's amazing is that God powerfully parted the Red Sea and allowed Israel to walk through, though the tangible evidence of his presence was not there in that moment. And so often we can get discouraged when we don't see the evidence of God's presence being there with us, but will we trust that he is at work even when we can't see him or feel him? And that's what Asaph was able to remind himself of here in his moment of distress. And finally, the fourth thing that Asaph did was to recognize that God uses people to fulfill his purpose. You see, in verse 20, he ends this psalm by saying, "You, O God, led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron." Asaph recognized that it was God who was leading his people, but the means by which he delivered them out of Egypt and through the Red Sea was by using Moses and Aaron. God often uses people to fulfill his purpose and bring deliverance. And so the question is, whom is God using in your life and in your circumstance right now to help you through your season of distress and your trials? Learn to recognize those people who are being used by the Lord in your circumstance. And give glory to the Lord for the help that he's bringing you through those people. And so my prayer is that this can encourage us in our seasons of distress, just like Asaph was able to be encouraged by the Lord in this psalm. God bless.